Welcome to Mythos AI, your source for Cliff's notes on complex subjects. Join Anna and Phil as they follow the road laid out by the American pageant, occasionally taking unexpected turns to explore the side paths history often hides.
Welcome to this deep dive. We're looking today at British North America, specifically the period between 1700 and 1763. It's a time that sees some, really fundamental changes setting the stage for later events.
Absolutely. And perhaps one of the most dramatic changes is just the sheer demographic boom. The population was nearly doubling every 25 years. Just think about that rate of growth.
So beyond just sheer numbers, what are maybe one or two key effects of that kind of explosion we should really grasp?
Well, one major thing is pressure on land. You simply have more people needing space and resources, so that naturally fuels westward expansion, pushing into new territories.
Which means encountering people already there.
Right, exactly. It leads directly to increased contact and often conflict with Native American groups. And then back east, especially in the port cities, as they get more crowded, you start seeing the beginnings of urban problems. Things like visible poverty, particularly noted in Boston even then.
Okay, that makes sense. And it wasn't just the existing Anglo population growing, was it? The sources mention increasing diversity.
That's a very important point.
Yeah.
Yes, a huge wave of non-English European immigration happens during this time. You have large numbers of Germans, maybe around 85,000 by 1770, many arriving before 1760. They're often fleeing religious persecution or war or economic hardship back home. They settle mainly in the middle colonies, Pennsylvania especially.
And what kind of roles did they typically take on?
Mostly farmers, laborers, sort of the middling folk.
Yeah.
Many came over through the redemptioner system, particularly in Philadelphia, where they'd pay off their passage through labor. They tended to keep their language and customs.
And alongside the Germans.
The Scots-Irish.
Yeah.
Even larger numbers, perhaps over 200,000 between 1717 and 1775. They were often driven by economic pressures, too high rents, poor harvests in Ireland and Scotland.
And where did they tend to settle?
They often pushed further west onto the frontier. Think the Pennsylvania backcountry, the Shenandoah Valley, the Western Carolinas.
So they're on the edge of settlement.
Yes, and that creates its own set of issues. They're predominantly Presbyterian, quite independent-minded. Their presence on the frontier inevitably leads to more friction with Native Americans and sometimes clashes with the colonial authorities further east, who might see them as, well, a bit unruly.
So a much more complex mix of people than perhaps we sometimes imagine.
Definitely. And we absolutely cannot forget the massive forced migration of enslaved Africans. Over 200,000 brought primarily to the southern colonies between 1700 and 1760, fueling that plantation economy. By 1774, they make up something like 21% of the total population.
A huge proportion. And other smaller groups, too.
Yes, French Huguenots, Welsh, Dutch, Swedes, Jews, Irish Catholics, Swiss, Scots Highlanders. It's becoming a real melting pot, though that term hides a lot of tension.
Right. This diversity brings pluralism, but also potential conflict. And that stark contrast between European opportunity, even with its hardships, and African enslavement.
A fundamental contradiction running through the whole period.
Okay, let's pivot to the economy. It sounds like different regions developed very distinct ways of making money.
They really did. In the north, especially New England, you see a focus on maritime activities. Fishing was important early on, but shipbuilding and commerce quickly became dominant. New England shipyards were building maybe a third of all British merchant ships at one point.
So lots of trade. What kind of trade?
Complex networks. You have the sort of infamous triangular trade involving rum, enslaved Africans, and West Indian molasses or sugar, but also extensive coastal trade and direct exports to the West Indies and even southern Europe.
And the middle colonies, you mentioned farming earlier.
Yes, they become the bread colonies. Places like Pennsylvania and New York export huge amounts of grain and livestock, primarily to the West Indies.
It sounds like trade was booming, but was it all above board?
Well, there's the rub. The colonies consistently bought more from Britain than they sold to her. This trade imbalance created pressure, so smuggling became quite widespread. Trading illegally with the French or Spanish West Indies or finding other markets was common practice to get around British navigation acts and make up the difference.
So a culture of, let's say, circumventing imperial rules was developing.
You could definitely say that. It fostered a certain economic dynamism, but also an independent streak, especially among merchants.
Okay, now let's contrast that with the South. You mentioned plantations and slavery.
Yes, the southern economy, especially the Chesapeake with tobacco and the lower South with the rice and indigo, becomes overwhelmingly dominated by large-scale agriculture. using enslaved labor.
Was it always enslaved labor? What about indentured servants?
There's a really significant shift during this period. Indentured servitude, which was common earlier, declines quite markedly in the South. Enslaved Africans become the primary labor force. This is driven by economics. Slaves are seen as a permanent, controllable labor source, and their children are also enslaved. It's tied up with the legal codification of race.
And the social impact of this system?
It creates immense wealth, but concentrates it in the hands of a fairly small planter elite. These families dominate Southern society and politics, so you get extreme social stratification. Much more pronounced inequality than in the North, especially if you factor in the enslaved population who have no wealth or standing.
What about labor in the towns or for those not on large plantations?
In the port cities north and south, artisans, skilled craftspeople are vital. You have bakers, blacksmiths, printers, coopers, shipwrights. They often worked in a hierarchical system. The master craftsman, the journeyman who had finished training, and the apprentice learning the trade. This offered some potential, at least, for upward mobility.
And below the artisans?
You still have indentured servants, though fewer, as we said. Sources included the poor from Britain, some convicts, and those German redemptioners. But getting land after service was becoming harder. You also see a growing number of free wage laborers, people working for daily or weekly pay, and tenant farmers, renting land rather than owning it.
And poverty. You mentioned it earlier in Boston.
Yes, particularly in the cities. Poverty becomes more visible. There's a population without property, reliant on wages or charity. So the class structure is quite clear.
Can you sketch that structure out?
Sure. At the top, you have the wealthy elite, those big planters in the South, the successful merchants in the North. Then a broad middle category, professionals like clergy or lawyers, most artisans, farmers who own their land. Below them, a lower class of tenant farmers, wage laborers, indentured servants. And at the very bottom, outside the system of rights altogether, enslaved Africans.
And mobility between these levels?
Limited for most. The idea of America as a land of easy opportunity was already becoming something of a myth. Moving up required land, capital, or connections, which many lacked. And racial slavery created a rigid, impassable barrier at the bottom.
This brings us back to race and slavery. How is this system legally cemented?
The early 1700s saw the formalization of slave codes. Virginia's 1705 codes are a key example. These laws explicitly defined enslaved people as property chattel, not as people with rights.
What kind of rights were denied?
Basic human rights. The right to bear arms, to travel freely without permission, to gather in groups, to testify against a white person in court. Interracial marriage was forbidden. They established separate courts and allowed extremely brutal punishments. Masters might even be acquitted if a slave died during correction, as they called it.
What was the purpose behind making these laws so harsh and specific?
Control, fundamentally. To manage and exploit the enslaved labor force, but also, crucially, to create a deep racial divide. By legally separating black people from white people, even poor whites, the elite aimed to prevent any potential alliances between the exploited groups. Race became a tool to maintain the social order.
Did enslaved people resist this system?
Constantly. Resistance took many forms, often subtle things working slowly, pretending to be ill, damaging tools or crops. Preserving their own culture, family ties, and traditions was itself a form of resistance.
And more overt forms.
Running away was a major form of resistance. We have countless runaway slave advertisements in colonial newspapers, which are grim documents, but they testify to this constant struggle for freedom.
Were there organized rebellions?
Yes, though less frequent because the risks were enormous and suppression was swift and brutal. The Stoner Rebellion in South Carolina in 1739 is the most famous example from this period. A group of enslaved people, led by a man named Jemmy, seized weapons, killed some white colonists, and tried to march towards Spanish Florida, hoping for freedom. Their numbers grew, but they were eventually caught and killed by the militia.
What were the consequences of something like the Stoner Rebellion?
Fear among the white population intensified, leading to even harsher laws. South Carolina passed the Negro Act of 1740 soon after. It placed even stricter limits on slaves' ability to assemble, earn money, learn to read, or even move about. It made manumission freeing slaves much harder. Slave patrols were strengthened. It's that cycle of resistance leading to repression.
How did white society, especially religious people, justify holding others in bondage?
It's complex and, frankly, disturbing. Pro-slavery arguments often involve twisting religious texts. Some pointed to servitude in the Old Testament or misinterpreted the story of Noah and the curse of Ham to apply to Africans. New Testament passages about servants obeying masters were also used. Some missionary efforts aimed at converting enslaved people sometimes emphasized obedience as a Christian virtue.
But surely there was religious opposition, too.
Absolutely. And this is vital. Groups like the Quakers were among the earliest and most vocal critics of slavery, arguing from fundamental Christian principles of equality and the Golden Rule. Other dissenting Protestant groups also raised concerns. These were the roots of the abolitionist movement.
So religious arguments were used on both sides. What about non-religious justifications?
Alongside the religious arguments, a distinct racial ideology emerged, claiming that Africans were inherently inferior, less intelligent, less civilized, and thus naturally suited for enslavement. This helped rationalize the brutal economic exploitation and square the circle, for some, with emerging Enlightenment ideals about liberty ideals that were clearly not being applied universally. Thomas Jefferson's later struggles with this contradiction are a famous example.
It seems the idea of colonial equality is really challenged by all this.
Deeply challenged. The reality was significant and likely growing wealth stratification. The richest colonists held an increasing share of the wealth. Among the free white population, levels of inequality might have been approaching those in Europe. And if you include the enslaved population as people rather than property, the inequality, especially in the South, was stark.
You mentioned the elites earlier, the planters and merchants.
Yes, these regional elites dominated not just economically, but politically and socially. They increasingly adopted lifestyles that mimicked the British aristocracy,
How so? What did that look like?
building large homes in the Georgian architectural style, importing fine British furniture, ceramics, silverware, textiles, following British fashion trends, sending sons to England for education, or undertaking a version of the Grand Tour of Europe. They formed exclusive social circles, often reinforcing their status through strategic marriages. This whole trend is sometimes called Anglicization.
Did this imitation strengthen ties with Britain?
It did, in a way. It affirmed their British identity and social standing, but it also created a cultural distance from the majority of colonists and deepened the economic dependence on British goods, contributing to that trade imbalance we discussed.
And what about professions? Did they offer a path to upward mobility?
Professions like the clergy, law, and medicine were developing, but access was often limited. University education was expensive and usually necessary for these fields. Even apprenticeships in skilled trades required some resources or connections. So these professions often became preserves of the existing elite or upper middle classes, reinforcing the social structure rather than significantly altering it. Mobility was possible, but not easy for most.
Let's shift gears slightly to religion again. We touched on justification for slavery, but there was also a major religious upheaval called the Great Awakening. What sparked that?
Well, by the early 18th century, there was a feeling in some quarters that the established churches, the Congregationalists in New England, the Anglicans in the South, had become a bit too formal, perhaps complacent. Less emphasis on deep personal piety. This coincided with growing religious diversity, especially in the middle colonies, and also the influence of the Enlightenment's emphasis on reason. The Great Awakening was, in part, a reaction against this perceived decline in religious fervor. It stressed a personal, emotional conversion experience being born again.
Who were the key figures driving this revival?
Two stand out especially. Jonathan Edwards in Massachusetts was a brilliant theologian and a powerful preacher. His most famous sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, used terrifying imagery to convey human sinfulness and the absolute need for God's grace and immediate conversion. It provoked strong emotional reactions.
Then the other figure?
George Whitefield, an English Anglican minister, but a real innovator in his methods. He was an incredibly charismatic orator. He toured the colonies multiple times, drawing enormous crowds, sometimes tens of thousands. He preached outdoors extemporaneously with drama and emotion, focusing on the necessity of a personal new birth. He became an intercolonial celebrity, his fame spread by newspapers.
Did everyone welcome this new style?
Oh, definitely not. It caused major controversy and splits within denominations. You had the New Lights, who supported the Awakening in its emotional style, versus the Old Lights, who defended the established order and condemned the revivals as chaotic and overly emotional, even dangerously misleading.
What were some of the broader effects of the Awakening beyond church splits?
Several important ones. Educationally, the New Lights founded several new colleges: Princeton, Brown, Rutgers, Dartmouth, primarily to train ministers sympathetic to the revival. This boosted higher education overall.
Any political effects?
Indirectly, yes. The awakening had a populist feel. It empowered ordinary lay people, challenging the authority of the established clergy. It fostered a more democratic religious culture, emphasizing individual conscience and experience. Some historians argue this questioning of religious authority helped pave the way for later questioning of political authority. It also created new intercolonial networks and shared experiences among ordinary people.
Did it affect specific denominations?
It significantly boosted the growth of more dissenting groups, like the Baptists and Methodists, who often thrived on the revivalist energy and advocated for greater religious freedom and separation of church and state.
Interesting how religion and politics seem intertwined. Now, what about culture more broadly? Literacy and the spread of ideas.
Literacy rates were actually quite high for the time, particularly among white men in New England, maybe approaching 90% by the Revolution. Rates were lower for women, but also rising. This supported an expanding print culture. Newspapers became more common, the Boston Newsletter, Franklin's Pennsylvania Gazette. Almanacs were hugely popular, especially Franklin's Poor Richard's Almanac. Pamphlets, printed sermons, imported books all circulated.
So print was helping to connect people and spread ideas.
Absolutely. The ideas of both the Great Awakening and the Enlightenment were disseminated through print, helping to create a shared public sphere across the colonies. You also have landmark moments like the John Peter Zenger trial in New York in the 1730s, which was seen as an early victory for the principle of freedom of the press, even though the legal precedent was complex.
We have to acknowledge the dark side of print too, right?
Yes, critically important. Those runaway slave advertisements we mentioned were a common feature of colonial newspapers, graphically illustrating how print culture also upheld and facilitated the system of slavery.
And Benjamin Franklin seems to loom large in this cultural landscape.
He really does. He embodies many aspects of the American Enlightenment. His scientific experiments, particularly with electricity, gained international recognition. His writings, like the autobiography and Poor Richard's Almanac, promoted values like hard work, thrift, self-improvement, and practical morality. He shaped ideals that became deeply ingrained in American culture.
And he was involved in civic life too.
Very much so. He was instrumental in founding numerous civic institutions in Philadelphia, a lending library, a fire department, the academy that became the University of Pennsylvania, a hospital. He believed in reason and progress applying to improving society.
How did Enlightenment ideas more broadly influence colonists?
Ideas from thinkers like John Locke about natural rights, consent of the governed, the right to resist tyranny provided a powerful intellectual framework. It encouraged skepticism toward arbitrary authority and gave colonists a language to articulate their rights, which they generally saw as the rights of British subjects.
So by 1763, have the colonies developed a unified American identity?
Not really, no. Regional identities remained very strong. A Virginian felt Virginian. A New Englander felt like a New Englander. Their primary loyalty was still local, or perhaps to the British Crown. However, shared experiences like the Great Awakening, the circulation of ideas through print, and dealings with imperial authorities were perhaps laying some groundwork. The middle colonies, with their ethnic and religious diversity, were arguably developing a practical kind of pluralism out of necessity, which pointed towards future American ideals. But a unified national identity was still a long way off.
Let's look more closely at that imperial relationship. You mentioned the Navigation Acts earlier.
Right, the Navigation Acts were the main legal framework for Britain's mercantilist control over the colonial economy. The basic rules were trade had to be carried on British or colonial ships. Certain valuable enumerated goods, like tobacco and sugar, could only be shipped to Britain or other British colonies, and most European goods had to pass through Britain first before going to the colonies.
Benefits and drawbacks.
Well, they did benefit colonial shipbuilding and provided colonial goods with a protected market in Britain. The Royal Navy offered protection. But they also restricted colonial manufacturing, limited trading partners, forced colonists to sell some goods cheaply to Britain and pay more for imports. And that trade imbalance led to a constant drain of currency from the colonies, hence the smuggling.
And the political relationship. You mentioned assemblies versus governors.
Yes, that was a constant dynamic. Most colonies had a royal governor appointed by the king, representing British authority, and an elected assembly representing the colonists, or at least the property-owning colonists. There was inherent tension. Governors tried to enforce imperial policies. Assemblies tried to protect local interests and expand their own power.
How did the assemblies assert power?
Their most potent weapon was the power of the purse control, over raising taxes and appropriating funds, including the governor's salary in many cases. Over time, the assemblies became increasingly assertive. modeling themselves on the British House of Commons, demanding similar rights and privileges. They frequently clashed with governors over legislation, appointments, and money.
So they were learning self-governance through practice.
Absolutely. These assemblies became crucial training grounds for colonial political leaders.
You also mentioned salutary neglect. How did that fit in?
Salutary neglect was Britain's unofficial policy, mostly in the first half of the 18th century, of relaxing strict enforcement of the Navigation Acts and other regulations. It was partly pragmatic. Enforcement was difficult across the Atlantic, but it allowed the colonial economies to prosper, often through that illicit trade we talked about. Crucially, it also allowed colonial political institutions, especially the assemblies, to grow in power and autonomy with minimal interference from London.
What was the long-term consequence of this neglect?
It fostered a strong tradition of local self-government and economic independence. Colonists got used to managing their own affairs. It nurtured a mindset that prioritized local interests and saw imperial directives as, well, sometimes negotiable or avoidable. So while most colonists still considered themselves loyal British subjects enjoying British rights, this period of relative freedom created expectations that would clash dramatically with Britain's attempts to tighten control after 1763.
It seems we need to be critical of any simple narrative about this period then, calling it uniformly democratic, for instance.
Exactly. We have to be careful with terms like democracy. Political participation was very limited, as we've discussed, based on property, race, and gender. Colonial politics was often an arena for elite competition, not mass participation in the modern sense. To ignore the exclusions and the dominance of elites gives a misleading picture.
What else tends to get downplayed in some traditional accounts?
The sheer scale and brutality of slavery and its absolute centrality to the economy and social structure, especially in the South. It wasn't a side issue, it was foundational. Also, the depth of economic inequality, the prevalence of poverty and landlessness for many free colonists, and the real limits on social mobility are often minimized in favor of the land of opportunity narrative. And internal conflicts, tensions between backcountry settlers and coastal elites, master-servant conflicts, and obviously the constant struggle inherent in slavery, these need to be part of the story.
So when we talk about colonial society, we need to ask, whose society?
Precisely. Traditional histories often centered the experiences of white, propertied men. We need to actively incorporate the perspectives and experiences of women, of enslaved Africans, of Native Americans facing dispossession, of indentured servants, of the free poor. It wasn't one monolithic society, but a complex, often deeply divided landscape of different realities, shaped profoundly by race, class, gender, and where you lived. Reading the sources critically helps us see that.
Speaking of sources, reflecting on those primary sources you mentioned earlier really drives these points home. Edwards' sermon.
Yes, sinners in the hands of an angry God. It shows that intense, perhaps terrifying spiritual worldview of the Great Awakening. The focus on human helplessness and the need for divine intervention. A very different mindset.
Contrasted with Franklin.
Right. Franklin's writings emphasize reason, practical morality, industry, self-reliance, improving the here and now through hard work and civic action. A much more secular, Enlightenment-oriented perspective, focused on worldly success and order.
And the runaway slave ad.
It's a brutal reminder of the human cost of the economic systems we've discussed. It shows the commodification of people, treating them as property to be hunted and returned. Yet even in the details descriptions of skills, clothing, scars, you get a glimpse of an individual resisting dehumanization. It powerfully underscores the centrality of slavery and resistance, cutting through any idealized image of colonial life.
So wrapping up this deep dive into 1700 to 1763, what are the main takeaways?
It's a period of incredible dynamism, explosive growth, increasing ethnic and religious diversity, developing regional economies, but also marked by deep contradictions, growing wealth alongside growing inequality, the embrace of Enlightenment liberty alongside the entrenchment of racial slavery, and an evolving, often tense relationship with Great Britain, characterized by both loyalty and growing autonomy.
A complex society full of internal tensions on the brink of major change. Thank you. This has been incredibly insightful.
It was my pleasure. There's so much to unpack in this era.
Indeed. And as you, our listeners, reflect on this period, maybe think about how these deep internal divisions, this experience of salutary neglect, this mix of identities, how did all this shape the way colonists reacted when Britain tried to change the rules of the game after 1763? What seeds, planted in this era of seeming stability, held the potential for the conflict that would eventually lead to revolution? And whose revolution was it, considering the vastly different experiences within the society? Lots to ponder.
Thanks for listening to Mythos AI. Stay tuned for more concise insights. And remember to hit the like button and subscribe for future episodes. Thanks for listening to Mythos AI. Stay tuned for more concise insights. And remember to hit the like button and subscribe for future episodes.